Every Move You Make is my latest book. It's a book of 7 stories. I hesitate to call them short stories because, in fact, 3 of them are quite long, more than 50 pages, which makes them more like short novellas. What I'm going to do at the moment is speak a little about how each of these stories comes into existence, and then a little about why I have brought them together. And then I'll read from one of the stories. I usually write novels, and writing novels is a very obsessive business. Once you've chosen the world of the novel and the characters and the tone of the writing, you're in there for as long as the book takes to write. It might be 6 months, it might be 2 years. It's good sometimes to have a little break from that. And it often happens that something out there in the world engages your interest, and you think, I think maybe there's a story here. So you break off from the novel and you follow the interest of that story. After a couple of days, I sometimes get to the end of what I know is happening in that story. And rather than push on, trying to find out what that is, I'll put the story aside, go back to the novel. And you do that also partly because you feel guilty about those characters you've left hanging there and the book you're supposed to be committed to writing. That means that I often have a lot of stories that I've started, that I'm still interested in, but which are waiting to be finished. That means either I don't know how they're going to go on, and I have to wait until I can see how that might be, or they're stories that I've left at a point where I do know what's going to happen, but I didn't want at the moment to go on and pursue that. And I mean, you can understand from that writing for me is a process of discovering, or letting the writing discover where it's going, rather than knowing beforehand what I want to do and simply setting about putting that down. So at some point when I think maybe now I'll put a book of stories together, I'll go to whatever I have in the drawer, see what I think can now be finished, but also start thinking about how these stories might speak to one another or amplify one another or play off one another in some kind of way. So there are 2 processes there. One is bringing each of the stories to some kind of completion, and the other is thinking which stories I'm going to put together in a book. And that is how each of my books have come about. Antipodes, quite a long time ago in 1984, Dream Stuff in 2000, and then last year, Every Move You Make. What that means is the stories have not been written for the collection. It means that some of those stories are quite old. Some of them in this collection, for example, the first long story, The Valley of Lagoons, Mrs. Porter, the story I'm going to read from, and the last story in the book, the Domestic Cantata. Those 3 stories go back between 5 and 10 years. And I'm not worried about that because I don't necessarily think of the stories existing in time so much for me as in space. I mean, these stories belong together, not because they belong to the same time when they were written, but because they speak to one another in some kind of way. And, you know, if the story is not fresh and new, still, after 5 or 10 years, it's certainly not going to be fresh or new after 50. So when the story was written doesn't worry me nearly so much as how the stories now, inside the covers of a book, might speak to one another. The rock is Ayers Rock, or Uluru in Central Australia, and Mrs. Porter is staying in the Grand Sheraton Hotel there with her son, Donald. They're at breakfast in the big dining room. Mrs. Porter has just served herself from the buffet. In fact, she doesn't intend to eat any of this stuff. Breakfast is just an excuse, so far as she is concerned, for a cigarette. But the buffet table here is a feature. Donald leads her to it each morning as if it was an altar. Leonard, that's her husband, too, had a weakness for altars. This one is garishly and unseasonably festive. A big blue Japanese pumpkin is surrounded by several smaller ones, bright orange, with shells like fine-boned china and pimpled. There are wheat sheaves, loaves of rye and 5-grain bread, spilled walnuts, almonds, a couple of hibiscus flowers. It's hard to know what is for decoration and what is to eat. And the effect, whatever was intended, has been ruined because some joker has, without ceremony, unceremoniously, plonked his saddle down right in the middle of it. Its straps all scuffed at the edges and with worn and frayed stitching, its seat discoloured with sweat. This saddle has simply been plonked down and left among the cereal jars, the plates of cheese, sliced ham and smoked salmon, the bowls of stewed prunes, tinned apricots, orange quarters, crystallised pears. But food is of no interest to her. She has helped herself so generously to the hot buffet, not because she is hungry and intends to eat any of this stuff, but so that she'll have something to look at, something other than it. It is everywhere. The whole place has been designed so that whichever way you turn, it's there displaying itself on the horizon, sitting out there like a great slab of purple-brown liver going off in the sun. No, not liver, something else. She can't think quite what. And then she can, suddenly she can. That's why she has been so unwilling to look at it. She is 7, maybe 8 years old. Along with her friends of that time, Isabel and Betty Olds, she is squatting on her heels on the beach at Etty Bay in front of their discovery, a humpbacked sea creature bigger than any fish they have ever seen, which has been washed up on this familiar bit of beach and is lying stranded on the silvery wet sand. Its one visible eye, as yet unclouded, which is blue like a far-off moon, is open to the sky. It is alive and breathing. You can see the opening and closing of its gills. The sea often tosses up flotsam of one kind or another, big green glass balls netted with rope, toadfish that when you roll them with a big toe, puff up till you think they're going to burst. But nothing as big and sad looking as this. You can imagine putting your arms around it like a person that has maybe been turned into a fish by a witch's curse and is unable to tell you that once, not so long ago, it was a princess. It breathes and is silent, cut off in a silence that makes you aware suddenly of your own breathing while the gulls rise shrieking overhead. They have the beach to themselves. They sit there, watching while the tide goes out. No longer swirling and trying to catch your feet, it goes far out, leaving the sand polished like a mirror to a silvery gleam, in which the light comes and goes in flashes, and the colours of the late afternoon sky are gaudily reflected. And slowly, as they watch, the creature begins to change. The blue-black back, the golden belly. The big fish begins to throw off colours in electric flashes, mauve, pink, a yellowish pale green. They have never seen anything like it. Slow fireworks. As if, out of its element, in a world where it had no other means of expression, the big fish was trying to reveal to them some vision of what it was and where it had come from. A lost secret they were meant to remember and pass on. Well, maybe the others had grasped it. All she had done was gape and feel the slow wonder spread through her. So they had squatted there, all three, and watched the big fish slowly die. It was a fish dolphin, a dorado, and it had been dying. That's what she knew now. The show had been its last. That's why she didn't want to look at this rock, just as she wouldn't want to look at the fish dolphin either if it was lying out there now, no matter what sort of performance it put on. Mrs. Porter is the kind of character who interests me a lot and that I like to use in stories. She's the sort of person that you look at and say, nothing much going on there. And then it's up to the writer, it's the writer's business, to look again and see that maybe there's more going on there than he first thought. She's come out here to look at Ayers Rock because Donald has insisted on that. She has had a husband, Leonard, who's taken her off to Europe to look at the cathedrals. He's told her that he wants to see Cologne Cathedral before he dies. And as she tells us in the story, he gets in another 6 cathedrals before that happens. So when Donald says to her, you should go and look at this rock, she says, you mean before I die? And then when she arrives there, she says to him, is there just one of these things, or are there a whole lot and I have to go on from this one to the rest? She's a woman of very, very little education, formal education, but she's got a very, very quirky take on most things. This little scene now is Donald and Mrs. Porter after dinner in the evening in one of the lounge rooms at the Sheraton. What now? Donald had lowered the novel he was reading and was watching her over the top of his glasses slide down just an inch at a time between the arms of the yielding, silk-covered lounge chair. They were in one of the hotel's grand reception rooms after dinner. What now, what? She demanded. What are you doing? Nothing, she told him. Getting comfortable. Dim lighting, the lampshades glowing gold. Outside the beginnings of night, blue luminous. The long room suspended out there in reflection, so that the lounge chairs and gold-legged glass-topped tables floated above a carpet of lawn, among shrubs that might simply have sprouted through the floorboards. And they too, she and Donald and some people who were standing in a group behind them, also floating and transparent in double exposure like ghosts. Meanwhile, shoes off, stocking feet extended, slumped sideways in the welcoming softness, she was getting her right hand down between the arm of the chair and the cushion, almost to the elbow now, right down in the crease there, feeling for coins or a biro or lost earring. You could find all sorts of things in such places if you got deep enough, as she knew from cleaning at home, not just dust balls. Once, in a big hotel at Eagle Hawk Neck in Tasmania, where she had gone to play in a bridge tournament, her friend, Tess Hyland, had found a used condom. Really? They must have been doing it right there in the lounge, whoever it was, late at night, in the dark. She hoped her fingers, as they felt about now, didn't come across anything like that. But she was ready, you had to be, for whatever. The tips of her fingers encountered metal. She slipped lower in the chair, settling in a lopsided position, very nearly horizontal like a drunk, and closed her fist on 1, 2, 3 coins more and a pen, but only plastic. For heaven's sake, Donald exploded. Maybe she looked as if she was having an attack. She abandoned the pen. With some difficulty, she wiggled her fist free and, pushing upright, smoothed her skirt and sat up, very straight now and defiant. Donald, with a puzzled look, went back to his novel, but continued to throw her glances. She snapped her handbag open, met his gaze, and very adroitly, she thought, slipped the coins in. 2 $1 pieces, a 20 cents, and some 5s. Not bad. She estimated there were about 30 such armchairs in the lounge, plus another half dozen three-seaters. Up to $100 that would make, lurking about as buried treasure in the near vicinity. Quite a haul if you got in before the staff. She wondered if she could risk moving to the third of the armchairs round their table, but decided she'd better not. Donald was already on the watch. What pleased her, amid all these ghostly reflections, was that the coins down there in their hidden places, like the ones she had just slipped into her purse, maybe because they had slipped deep down and smuggled themselves out of sight, had retained their lovely solidity and weight. That was a good trick. What she had to do was to work out how she might manage it. This last passage is Mrs. Porter waking up in the middle of the night in her room. She has a lot of trouble with her room because she feels that she can't live up to its cupboard space, for one thing, and the two double beds that they've got in there. She's fallen asleep and now she wakes up. She got up and went in her stockinged feet to the window. It was as if something out there at the end of the night was sending out gong-like vibrations that made the whole room hum and glow. The rock, darkly veined and shimmering, was sitting like a cloud 100 feet above the earth. Had simply risen up, ignoring the millions of tons it must weigh, and was stalled out there on the horizon, like an immense spacecraft. And the light it gave off was a sound with a voice at the centre of it saying, "Look at this. So what do you reckon now?" Mrs. Porter looked at it askance, but she did look. And what she felt was an immense and unaccountable happiness, as if the rock's newfound lightness was catching. And she remembered something, a time when Donald had just begun to stand unsteadily on his own plump little legs, and had discovered the joy of running away from her towards a flower he had glimpsed in a garden bed, or a puppy dog, or his brother's red tricycles. When she called, he would give a quick glance over his shoulder and run further. Suddenly unburdened, she had had to hang on to things. The sink, Leonard Stelzner upright, so as not to go floating clean off the linoleum, as if after so many months of carrying them, inside her body or on her hip, first the one then the other, she had forgotten the trick of letting gravity alone hold her down. Now, looking at the rock, she felt as if she had let go of something and was free to join it, to go floating, like a balloon that some small child, Donald perhaps, had let go of, and which was free to go now wherever the world might take it. She glanced down. She was hovering a foot above the carpet. So it had happened. She was off. Immediately, she began to worry about Donald. She needed to get word to him. That did it. She came down with a bump, and with her heart beating fast in the fear that it might already be too late, she made for the door. She needed to reassure him, if he didn't already know, that she hadn't really minded all those times when he'd hung onto her skirt and dragged her off to look at this or that, so full of need and bullying insistence, she saw now, because if she didn't look and confirm that yes, it was amazing, it really was, he couldn't be sure that either he or it was there. She had gone grudgingly and looked and pretended, because she had never given up the hard little knot of selfishness that her mother had warned her would one day do her in. Well, her mother was wrong. It had saved her. Without it, she would have been no more than a space for others to curl up in for a time, then walk away from. All this, in her newfound lightness, she understood at last, and wanted to explain to the one person who was left who might understand it and forgive. Still wearing the frock she had lain down in, she flung the door open, and barely hearing the click as it closed behind her, stepped out into the hotel corridor. Only then did she realise that she did not know the number of Donald's room. She made for a small flight of stairs at the far end of the corridor that went down to a door, And when she opened it, and it too clicked shut behind her, found herself outside the building altogether, standing in her stockinged feet on stone flags that were still warm. The warmth came right up through her, and all about were night-flowering shrubs and bigger trees with boughs that drooped. She took a good breath. The air was heavy with scent, with different scents. Night insects were twittering. All was clear moonlight, as still as still. She began to walk. How simple things could be, enjoying her own lightness and wondering if she wasn't still asleep and dreaming. Only in dreams did your body dispose of itself so easily. She walked on springy lawn. But they must have been watering it, because almost immediately her stockings were soaked. She sat down on a low wall and peeled them off, and when she looked back, gave a little laugh at the look of them there on the shadowy grass. Like two snakeskins, a couple. That'll make 'em guess. Soon she was in a car park, empty but flooded with moonlight, and then out again into soft sand. Red sand, still with the warmth of the sun in it, but cooler when you worked your toes in. Luxurious. She waded to the top of a dune and let herself go, half sliding, half rolling, till she came to a stop and was on level ground again. She righted herself and, seated in warm sand, checked for broken bones. All around her, the bushes, which were spiky and had seemed dull by day, were giving off light like slow-burning fireworks. Big clouds rolled across the moon, thin as smoke, then darker. There was a twittering, though she could see no birds. Everywhere, things were happening. That's what she felt. Small things that for a long time now she had failed to notice. To see them, you had to get down to where she was now, close to the ground, at kiddie level. Otherwise, there were so many other things to demand your attention that you got distracted. You lost the habit of looking, of listening, unless some kiddie down there dragged at your skirt and demanded, "Look, Mum, look." She looked about and saw that she was in the midst of a lot of small grey-green bushes with daylight coming, and no landmarks she could recognise. "My God," she said to herself, Where am I? This isn't my life." The rock was there, looming dark against the skyline. She made for that.